Part of the reason I think a lot of Americans have trouble understanding Bitcoin is that we have a relatively well-functioning society and monetary system compared to other places in the world. So we don't see the immediate need. But when I saw that in Canada, I was like, oh my goodness, like that could easily happen here, regardless of which side you're on. And then a few months later, not even a few months later, you have freezing Russia's foreign reserves. And it's like,
I'm Ashley McFarland, a nonprofit executive living in Duluth, Minnesota, and you are listening to the Vance Grow Podcast.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm glad you're here. Today, we have certified financial planner David Oransky from Laminar Wealth on. Now, if you're one of those people that thinks, I'm not really interested in money or how the Fed works or interest rates, then you may be in for quite a surprise. David has an extraordinary talent for taking really complicated ideas about the economy and making them approachable. David, a few months ago, wrote a letter to all of his clients saying that he thought that they should convert at least 1% of their portfolio into Bitcoin. This is a strange and wondrous move in a world of very conservative financial planners that stick generally straight down the middle of the road. So I decided to invite David in to have a conversation about how the economy works and really discuss what money is. I hope you enjoy this conversation because it is a wild ride with a man that is very interesting. We're going to get to that in just a moment, but we've been doing legacy interviews here in the studio. And one of the questions we often get is, can I do both of my parents together? Well, when we do legacy interviews, we offer the opportunity to either sit down with one parent as an individual and do a 2-hour conversation with them, or you can have both parents there together. Sometimes in some relationships, that dynamic of two people talking and communicating and laughing and reacting is exactly the thing that you want to capture. And other times you recognize, no, I think mom needs her chance to really talk about her childhood and the way she thought parenting went. And then let's bring dad in and let him do one on their own. Either way, it's completely up to you. And if you're interested in having us capture the stories of your parents, go to legacyinterviews.com. All right, without further ado, let's head to the interview with my man, David Oransky. David Oransky, welcome.
Thanks for having me. It's been a long time coming.
Yeah, man, as I look around at the world, I have to ask myself, why in the world are there as many financial planners out there as there are here in the United States?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of financial planners. I have actually no idea if the number has grown significantly recently, but I mean, when I look at my own office building, there's a financial planner that's across the hall, and one just moved in yesterday next to me. So, I mean,
one just moved in down the hall from here.
Yeah, so they're everywhere. I think part of it is it's one of the few professions left where you can still kind of be self-employed. There's not very many of those, and this is one that it's still feasible. And in many ways, in the last decade, it's become easier as technology has all gone to the cloud and everything is priced per user rather than a big software license. It's allowed more people to go out on their own. It's also that financial planning is kind of the combination of estate planning and investments and taxes. And so all these professionals that maybe used to have one specific thing they focused on, whether it was taxes or investing or estate planning, are now looking to bridge them all together. And they call that financial planning. And so you see lots of CPAs getting into financial planning, lots of investment advisors that used to only be, stockbrokers trying to do financial planning now. So everyone's calling themselves a financial planner, but there's still a huge range of what that means. Like some people are just kind of still doing their old thing, but dabbling a little bit in financial planning. And then some people are truly doing financial planning. And I think that is an area that's growing. There are people now that are just financial planners that don't manage assets, that don't do taxes, that don't do anything else. They're just financial planners. And a lot of that you see catering towards like the millennial crowd and charging like a subscription fee for that. So there's definitely a intent within the profession that we need more financial planners to help people, and trying to bring more and more people in that. There's CFP financial planning programs at a lot of colleges now that I'm not sure that existed at all when I went through college.
No, I mean, I remember, so I grew up, my dad was a stockbroker. And for someone, when I was a kid, 30 years ago, to have a stockbroker was like a big deal. Like That was something like, oh, that guy has a stockbroker, which is where Edward Jones really fit in a weird way. But then like, as we go on and now we're adults, now I have people approach me. I cannot even imagine being a 25-year-old going out there and knocking on people's doors and being like, hey, 45-year-old, I have never accumulated wealth, nor have I been able to grow it or, anything, but I think I should do it for you. I think it's a hard profession to break into psychologically, just as a salesperson.
Yeah, I can see that. And I get Edward Jones people knocking on my door sometimes, and it's always funny. Even after I tell them I'm a financial advisor, they continue on with their pitch sometimes. But I mean, it's like, a doctor. Like, there's cancer doctors who've never had cancer and they treat cancer. Like, I don't know that you need to necessarily have gone through the experience yourself to be able to guide others through it. I think there's certain aspects that make you much better if you have experience. And so when I started out, I mean, I was in my 20s and I tried to make up for what I didn't have an experience with knowledge. I read everything I possibly could. And yeah, there was things that I missed that on paper looked like they were the right thing to do. But once you understand human behavior, don't work as well. And so I learned a lot more, but I'm still don't have nearly the experience that, a baby boomer has.
Who was the first type of person that said, yeah, man, I'll hand you some money and hopefully you can make it more money?
Well, after I left the accounting world and went into, work for a wealth management firm, I was just kind of a behind the scenes junior, financial planner. I was doing a lot of the work, but I wasn't the face in front of the clients. And one of the advisors had a family emergency when a new prospect was coming in, and the CEO pulled me in just to basically be a warm seat, be the other face there. And I probably wasn't able to fully stay quiet, and we ended up getting the client. And he said, well, great, here's your first client. And it started with that. So, I mean, initially you borrow a lot of the credibility from the more senior person, and eventually people realize, oh, you're the one actually doing everything. And then they start to, trust you more. But I was also, at this point, I was in California. So I was in Palo Alto. Most of our clients were Silicon Valley, tech people that had made their money, their company gone public. Like, these people were in their 20s and 30s. And so it wasn't, to them, it was like, oh, well, I'm really good at what I do, and you must be good at what you do. And there was almost a, being young wasn't seen as a bad thing. Whereas I think probably many other places in the country, it was, oh, I can't trust you with my money. Like, I need someone that's been doing this for decades.
Yeah, actually, so full disclosure, you're my financial planner. And the interesting thing was, I definitely didn't want an older person, because by the time I found you, I already was well acquainted with what was going on in Bitcoin. And I thought, like, hey, some of the old ways of thinking about things. I really trusted my dad's advice, but he was getting out of the game. So now I had to find somebody. And you were an interesting blend, because my wife is like hardcore details, very, very conservative. I'm much more like, hey, let's put it on 32 red, because I feel like I have an intuition about this. And so for her to be able to find a blend, a person that was like able to be on the edge enough to satisfy what I was interested in, but then conservative or detail oriented enough to like make her confident, was an interesting blend.
Yeah. I mean, I think I was kind of in a position where when I started in the industry, like, I was already working with bigger clients right away. I didn't, everyone said go after your natural market, and it was mostly young people, but I immediately was working with young people that happened to have money. And so I had to develop, I had to be very conscientious. This wasn't, and the people supervising me weren't just going to let me, run wild and see what happens, because these were big clients, even though they were young and even though I was young. But it's also just part of my nature. I'm very conscientious. I view, from the beginning, like, my view of personal finance and investing, because of the clients I was working with, was much more not how do we get rich, but how do we stay rich? Because most of our clients already had wealth. They had enough money that they could be financially independent. And so I think I am far more conservative financially than the average person. I only will take risks that I think, where it's warranted to pay off. I don't view it as gambling. I think, you can gamble through investing, and that is a way that you can make a lot of money doing it. The way I invest, it's probably not going to get you rich, but hopefully if you're there, it'll keep you there. That's kind of the way
you preserve wealth, or compound your earnings
yeah. I mean, there's still trade-offs, right? Like, you don't want to put everything in super, what may be safe for the short term may not be safe for the long term. And so sometimes the best defense is a good offense. And there are certain times where you need to take more risk. And I think one of the things that I always think about is it's less important to avoid the bad investments as it is to make sure you own the good ones. The good investments, wherever they show up, tend to be so good that they more than make up for things that don't go well. And so, when I'm looking at, are there certain risks or certain assets that if we don't own, that have the potential to be a big deal, and that if we don't own, like, could really hurt us. And so I'm okay with knowing that parts of the portfolio aren't going to do well because I don't know which ones. Like, if I knew which ones, then yeah, sure, we wouldn't own them, but you only get that with hindsight. So it's a little bit different of an approach than some people. I think I am more conservative, but then there's other things that you would say, well, that's not conservative at all. Like, why do you recommend Bitcoin?
The best example was after several years of us being in working together, I get an email from you one day that is you telling all of your clients, I believe that you should have a certain percentage of your portfolio in Bitcoin. And I don't see any other financial planners doing that.
There's some, but not many. And the ones that do typically are much more in the broader crypto sphere. But that was something that, I first heard of Bitcoin in 2011. Someone that I took economics with sent it to me, and I remember getting the email and being like, wow, this is really cool, but like, it's never going to work. And really didn't think much more of it. And every now and then it would pop up. And then in 2017, when Bitcoin kind of left the dark corners of the internet and suddenly everyone was talking about it, and I had lots of clients bringing it up, and some clients had already had some. And I still at that point, didn't think much of it, in part because people send me investment ideas constantly all day long, and most of them are not worthwhile. And so you develop heuristics and intuition for what's even worth analyzing, because you can't analyze everything that comes across your desk. And if you run Bitcoin through your heuristics, for most people, it looks like a get-rich-quick scheme, or maybe even an outright scam. And so most people don't even analyze it. And I didn't go deep enough. And it wasn't until 2019, and there was at this point, Bitcoin had fallen from 20,000 down to 10 and was bouncing around that range. It had gone down to, I think, 3 at one point. And there was a few people that I knew that were completely undeterred. And while everyone else said, Bitcoin was dead and dancing on the grave of Bitcoin, there were some people that I thought were very intelligent and agreed in a lot of other areas, and was like, what do they know that I don't know? Or who's wrong? Either they're wrong or I'm wrong. And I want to find out more. And so that's when I dug into it. And so I'm probably one of the few people that entered Bitcoin not during an upcycle. And that was probably how I had to do it, because I don't like getting wrapped up in hype and feeling like I'm being pressured to do something. And so in late 2019, Bitcoin was boring. And so I had all the time in the world to dig in and read about it, and expected to learn about it, but still not be convinced, or think that, well, even if this could be something, it's still not worthwhile to have in the portfolio. It's some venture-backed company type of investment, which I just don't do because most of them fail. And instead I came out the other side being like, oh my goodness, I totally missed this because it didn't pass my initial screening.
The totally missing it, like I remember, so the person that exposed me to Bitcoin in a deep way, Rob Long, has been a guest on the podcast a couple times. And I remember me sitting, it was about 8 years ago, like right around this time in fall. And he sat me down and I was like, all right, give it to me one more time. And when I started to understand like a few key things, 21 million, there'll never be more. How does this actually go into a wallet? How does this work? This is just the very, very beginning. I describe it as like having a chance to see the edge of the universe, right? Like where you feel this sense of awe, this sense of like, wait a second, how could this possibly be true? And then have had for the next 8-9 years, whatever it was, this experience of like having a question about it, being like, I don't know, how is that going to work? And then discovering like how deeply this thing has been thought through.
How deeply it's been thought through, and the community that's sprung up around it. It's really a free market of ideas, and everyone's constantly testing it and making it better. And yeah, we're continuing to discover new features of Bitcoin that we're like, oh my, did somebody truly think all of this through and design it? Or is some of this just emerged? I used to think Bitcoin was just magic internet money. And I still do, but now I don't mean that as an insult. Like, I think it really is that magical. And it's so elegantly simple when you look at it, and it is yet, has the ability, I think, to eventually grow into kind of the base layer of money. And I think that will eventually happen. I just don't know over what time scale.
So the fact that it's magic internet money, one of the things that's truly beautiful about Bitcoin is they created digital scarcity, right? So normally things on the internet, you can take a photograph and you can
right. That's the
replicate
value
it
of
infinitely.
digital things is that you don't have scarcity anymore.
So what is the value of setting Bitcoin at an arbitrary number, 21 million? And why is this valuable, do you think?
Because money itself is just information. Like money, like it doesn't matter. 21 million is somewhat arbitrary. I mean, there's reasons that Satoshi chose 21 million. It roughly correlates that if it were to grow into, the global currency, that you'd have enough monetary units to somewhat be on par with, say pennies and a dollar or something like that. It also, I think, has some math where it's easily, divisible by certain things and just works out cleanly. But you could have a different number. Like the quantity of money doesn't matter because money is just acting as the medium of figuring out exchange rates between any two goods. So if you didn't have money, you'd have to know the exchange rate between, how many apples does it take to buy a car? How many, fish does it take to buy a bushel of apples? How many hours of labor do I need to exchange to buy a house? And you'd have to know all these things. Money allows you to have just an exchange rate with the base layer of money so that becomes the information. And it allows then society to allocate those resources based on the aggregate of what everyone's viewpoint on that. So like as soon as you start changing the money supply, you're introducing noise to the system. Like that's unnecessary. So having the ability to print money, to either create money or remove money isn't adding anything to that equation of like, how do we price things? Like how do we determine the exchange rates? It's really a form of manipulation and misinformation, really. And so it's not surprising then that things get messed up when we manipulate the money. And so the beauty of Bitcoin being truly scarce is that it takes all that out. Once you hit 21 million, you remove all those other factors. And before Bitcoin, the best thing we had was gold. And the reason gold became money was because it had what we call the highest stock to flow ratio, meaning there was a lot of gold that had already been produced, and yet it was incredibly difficult to produce more of it. So gold, only inflates or dilutes its supply at about 1.5% per year. And that's been relatively consistent throughout much of history.
Meaning that 1.5% of the entire amount of gold that's out there can get mined every year. And if the price goes up, you could go out and mine more, but it's increasingly expensive to bring more gold out.
Yeah, and that's because although we've gotten better and better at extracting gold, we've also taken all the easy gold deposits. So it's like a built-in difficulty adjustment into nature. So Bitcoin was really designed to take all the virtues of gold, but put it in a digital space. And so, gold was successful because it was scarce. It also does pretty well in the other characteristics of money. Like you want money to be divisible. You want money to be portable. You want money to be fungible. You want money to not degrade over time. And gold did all that really well, with maybe the one exception of it wasn't very divisible. Because, gold is scarce enough on an absolute level that even a very small amount of gold would be equivalent to like a week's worth of labor for many people. And so that's why over time you had silver spring up next to gold as being the next metal or commodity that existed naturally in the world that didn't dilute very much. And so, but it's the stock to flow ratio on silver, I want to say, is somewhere in the 20 to 25 range, which means it would dilute at about 4 to 5% a year. So not as good as gold, but still the second best of things that could function as money. And so silver sprung up as the day-to-day transactions and gold was long-term store of value. But over time, as global trade became more and more prevalent, like precious metals you had to transport them. It was very inefficient to move them. It was very risky. There was shipwrecks, there was thievery. And so people started using pieces of paper to have deferred settlement. Like, okay, the gold can stay in the vault with this trusted banker and we'll just trade this piece of paper. And that's how, the system worked for a long time. And then eventually we removed the gold from the equation and we just trade a piece of paper. And that's the system we're on now. And for my entire life, we've been on this pure fiat system where there is nothing backing the money other than credit, other than debt. And it seems normal, but the reality is it's an experiment that's only been going on for 50 years. And so people criticize Bitcoin if it's only 14 years old, like no one's ever going to trust it. We've only been on a pure fiat system for 50 years. That's 4 times as long. Like for the rest of history, going back thousands and thousands of years, we've been on something that had scarcity. We've been on precious metals. And anytime any other society used a form of money other than gold and silver, when they interacted with a society that did use gold and silver always won out.
And when you say won out, what do you mean?
So societies will quickly converge on one form of money. So lots of things were used as money early on. You could have livestock, you could have tools, seashells. Seashells could be great money in a place that wasn't near the ocean. But if you live near the ocean and anyone can walk down the beach and pick up seashells, it's not scarce and it's not a very good form of money. And so over time, though, like different things are being used as money. And if you're an early, person in these early societies, it's to your benefit to try to think ahead of which goods will other people demand in the future. And if you can accurately do that, you have the ability to go collect or create those goods before there's widespread demand, and you hugely benefit from that. But then it creates a self-fulfilling prophecy almost, because if I start collecting what I think will be money in the future, that increases the demand today and the price adjusts, it goes up, which then causes other people to pay attention. They say, lots of people seem to want that good. I think I should hold that as money too. And you quickly get this positive feedback loop where most societies very quickly converge on one form of money. And if two interacted, the harder money almost always won out. Harder meaning hard to produce. So high stock to flow ratio or a low kind of inflation rate. And that's where gold kind of became king.
It's an interesting thing when you go look at the history of money and you watch how governments are always, they're the ones that say, hey, society, this is, now that we have this system going on, we're going to have this money. This is what's going to be official. So if you go look at gold, right, the Roman Empire is using gold to be able to say, hey, this is the official coin. And people can kind of figure out how much is this coin worth relative to livestock or apples or things like that. But over time, eventually the government's always like, hey, if we shave this coin down a little bit, we can keep telling them that the coin is worth this much, but now we can increase our own coinage by 15%.
That's happened time and time throughout history. So after gold kind of won out as money, at that point, it was still being, lumps of gold. It wasn't in a standardized form. And it was the first coins that we know about came in about 700 BC in Lydia, which is modern day Turkey. And it was the first time that we had true coinage. And that allowed money to finally be a unit of account. We had a standardized weight and purity. And that was a huge boon for trade and it worked out. The problem was, you also needed somebody to standardize that, someone to mint the coins so that it was a standard way they were going to, and who do people trust? Well, that's where kings and governments kind of filled that role. They also had the benefit of getting to put their faces on these coins, which, for a king or a ruler is a nice thing. And so, you can look at the Roman Empire and they had I think theirs was a silver coin, the denarii, and the global empire was huge. So that really was the world's first global monetary standard was this, Roman denarii. And I think at the time that Caesar was emperor, it was like 98% silver. And then by the 2nd century, when Marcus Aurelius was emperor, it was down to like 80% or so. And by the 3rd century, it was down to like 5% silver because time and time again, they exactly what you said. They say, hey, if we shave a little off or if we dilute it, we'll put in some less precious metal in there. That allows them to basically extract wealth and effectively print money, as we would call it today. And that's good for them. But over time, people catch on. And then when people no longer trust the money, you get civil unrest and stuff falls. So I think governments getting involved with money both led to the rise and fall of many, many empires. And what happened after the Roman Empire fell? We entered the Dark Ages. And the thing that finally brought us out of the Dark Ages was all the city-states popping up in modern-day Italy. And one of those was Florence, where they created a gold coin called the florin. And keep in mind, these city-states weren't like big nation-states. They were very almost like free anarchist societies in a way that just sprung up around like capitalism. And their gold coin, the florin, maintained its weight and purity for over 4 centuries. And not coincidentally, that was the Renaissance. So that's when we got all the advancements in mathematics and art and architecture and all these amazing things came out of a period where we had a very, very stable monetary system. I don't think that's coincidental.
Yeah, I mean, like they talk about the difference between hard money and soft money, right? And if you can count on the fact that the money you're using is going to hold the same amount of value tomorrow or the next day or, a few years from now, then you don't have an incentive to spend it as quickly as possible, right? If you know that your money is going to be worth 8% or 10% less next year, then you want to spend that money now. Yeah. And I think the thing that comes out of that, or at least one of the hypotheses is, well, this explains why you have people that build buildings that are short term now, right? Because they're like, I don't have time. Whereas when you think about the Renaissance, they're able to be like, hey, we can invest in these giant chapels.
Well, and what's so ironic about that is a lot of building design these days is based on, building green buildings. And the thing is, most of the environmental impact of a building is its construction. And so although they may be using more green materials, if that building gets torn down in 30 years and they build a new one, like on the whole, it may have actually been way, way worse for the environment versus buildings they would build hundreds of years ago that are still standing because they're beautiful buildings that were built rock solid and sometimes out of rock. And so which one's more environmentally friendly? I guess it depends over what time scale you're looking at.
Yeah, and the incentive then becomes that you can take the time to build a cathedral or a thing that takes you 2 or 3 generations in order to get it done.
No one does it anymore.
No one would do that now. It would be seen as the most foolish thing that you could possibly do. Not to mention, one of the biggest reasons you ever see cranes in a city anymore is not because there's capitalistic opportunities. It's because there's tax credits. It's because there's government financing. Somebody else is blowing oxygen onto those buildings.
Yeah. And that gets back to when you manipulate the money, either through the supply or through interest rates, like I said earlier, money is just information. So manipulating the money is creating misinformation, and money is one of the base layers of society. So to me, it's no wonder that you have all this misallocation and misinformation throughout society. Like, you are messing with one of the base layers of it when you do that.
So let's talk about the U.S. system. What is it about the U.S. dollar and the way that it works that most people they're just spending money. They get a paycheck, they put it in the 401k. What do most people not know about the way the dollar works?
Probably a few things. One is that we often, I think people assume that natural inflation rate is some low level inflation, say 0 to 2%. That's kind of the natural equilibrium. In reality, technology is always deflationary. Technology and innovation allows us to create more things with fewer inputs. And that always has been. And we saw this, during the kind of the second industrial revolution, back when we had, steel companies coming online and the railroad and all that. Like, it was a major deflationary environment because technology causes deflation. It makes your money more valuable. Your money can buy more if you have a limited supply of money. And so things should be getting cheaper every year as technology. And we see these things in flat screen TVs. There was a time when flat screen TVs would cost thousands of dollars, and they were plasma. And if you left them paused for too long, they'd get burned. And now you can go to Costco for a few $100s and buy a flat screen TV that's way, way better than the thing that cost thousands of dollars years ago. And that's because the technology has increased so exponentially that it defies all of the increase of the money supply. Like, there's deflation, even though everything else is inflating. But the reality is technology is deflating everything. So if you were to not create any money in a system, the real state of the world would be negative inflation, deflation. So things would get cheaper on the order of, there's no way to exactly measure this, but estimates I've seen are somewhere around 2 to 4% would get cheaper every year. And so instead, what you do, so we don't get that, is we print money. And I think on average, the US has printed about 7% a year. And when I say print, I'm using that. I know they're not literally printing money, but they're expanding the money supply by about 7% a year. So you take like a negative single digit natural deflation, you add 7% money supply inflation. Oh, guess what? You get low single digit inflation. That's kind of where we are. And so the issue with that is that rather than the productivity gains from technology being spread broadly throughout society and everyone who holds the dollar benefits by being able to buy more next year, you kind of create the opposite of that system, where everything's getting more expensive. And so you encourage people to spend more, which a lot of economists think is good. They want people to go out and spend because that boosts GDP and it makes it look like we're growing. I think it's short-sighted because a lot of what people are buying, they're not putting a lot of thought into. They're disposable things. And that if people thought their money would become more valuable, they'd be a lot more careful with how they spent their money. They'd save. Like, we have kind of a savings crisis and people are trying to figure out how to solve that. One of the basic economics lessons is people respond to incentives, and we have incentivized them to spend and consume in the present rather than plan long-term for the future.
Yeah, and everything around it, right? The Federal Reserve comes out and they don't say, we just moved interest rates. They say, we're going to move interest. We're going to make money more expensive for you to borrow. So you should go borrow today in order to be able to get people to, get excited, inject more commerce into the system. So what is going on, though? Why is it when people talk about inflation or deflation, anytime I've ever had a podcast guest on, I'm probably 10 for 10 on this one. If I say, what's wrong with deflation? They're like, oh, God, no, we don't want deflation. That would be the worst thing ever. Would it be the worst thing ever?
In our current system, it'd be very painful. That's because our entire monetary system is based on debt and credit. So literally, our money is what's backing that is U.S. debt. And so,
What does that mean? Start from the
okay.
beginning.
So back when the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, the world was on a gold standard, which meant that, basically every currency was tied to gold, and you could figure out the exchange rate between, the dollar and the pound based on how much gold backed it. Like, you didn't need to figure out all these, supply and demand markets. It was just, well, what's the gold price? And so you can think of almost like a pyramid of money, where at the top you have your base layer money, which would be gold. That is, what I would truly consider money. When I delineate between money and currency, I think of as money as an asset that is no one else's liability. So if you hold a gold coin, you are not relying on anyone else to perform a service to have that be valuable. Conversely, if you own a bond, that's an asset to you. You've lent money to a government or a corporation or to somebody. And so that's an asset to you because they owe you that money back, but it's a liability to them. If they don't perform on that, your asset's worthless. And so most money, so if you go back to the gold standard, you had gold in the vaults at the Fed and at banks, and you had dollar bills, and those notes were redeemable for gold. They were an IOU that you can think of like a coat check. You go put your coat in there, and anytime you want it back, you bring your deposit slip and they give it back to you. And that was, the system for a long time. And then, so 1913, we had the Federal Reserve. A few years later, we entered World War I. We needed to help finance that war. And very quickly, the Fed started buying U.S. Treasuries. So they started putting U.S. Treasuries kind of at that top base layer at which then they could create notes for, our dollar bills.
What does that mean to buy a U.S. Treasury?
So treasuries are bonds that the U.S. government sells. So in order for the government can raise money in multiple ways. One of the ways is through taxation. The other way is through borrowing. Issuing U.S. treasuries, you give them money and they give you a bond, and then they get to go spend that money.
So you give me $100 today, we'll take that, and 5 years from now, we'll give you $110.
Yeah, they'll pay interest twice a year, and then you get your money back at the end of it. Is typically how it works. And so that is an asset, but it's also someone else's liability. And so at the time the Fed was created, I think the Fed balance sheet was like 84% gold. And it's fractionally reserved, meaning that they don't actually have to have a 1-for-1 exchange, even then, of dollars for gold. But they had at that point, 85% was in gold. And they had a minimum that they had to maintain of 35%. So in other words, like however many dollars they have, 35% of that has to be backed by gold. And that was a level that I think nobody really reasonably expected them to get to. They had 84%. So then you get, out of World War I, you get the roaring 20s, lots of easy credit money created, eventually led to a lot of misallocations, which is part of what led to the Great Depression. And the Fed moves to try to unfreeze the system. And they do that by creating reserves. And reserves you can think of as wholesale money. So the Fed has two different types of like what I would call layer 2 money, which are the IOUs on the base layer money, which back then was gold. The reserves are wholesale money that banks hold. They can hold it. They can exchange it with each other. They hold it on the Fed's balance sheet. And they would move to, reliquify the system by creating reserves. The problem is they quickly didn't have enough gold in the vault. They could create more reserves, but they couldn't go over 35%. And so they needed gold. And so nobody wanted to deposit gold into the Fed or any of their banks because at this point, people were worried about financial unrest. And what do people do when they're worried? They don't want their money in banks. They want to hold that first layer money, the asset that's no one else's liability. And so there was no way people were going to deposit gold. And so then in 1933, we got Executive Order 6102. FDR said, everyone has to turn in their gold. You've got to go give it to the Fed. And so everyone turned in their gold to the Fed. And at that point, there was a fixed exchange rate of $20.67 for an ounce of gold. The next year, after they'd confiscated all the gold, they devalued the dollar. So now it was $35 to 1 ounce of gold. And then the Treasury took the gold from the Fed. They took the Fed's gold too. And then the next year, I think we got the FDIC, which was to prevent those bank runs from happening. And the FDIC is mostly psychological. There is not enough money in the FDIC to actually bail out a systemic bank failure.
But let's go back to the gold thing. Like, this is one of those, like, people have trouble wrapping their minds around this, that the U.S. government came to their citizens and said, you are required by law to turn over your gold. And by the way, if 20, 30, 40 years later, we find out that you still have that gold, you can go to prison for it.
Yeah.
You can, all of that will be confiscated. And, even though they eventually didn't make it illegal to own or hold gold, it became
In
legally
1974, yeah.
right. But that's 40 years later. And even after they made it legal, if you had kept your gold, it was still illegal to hold.
Yeah, I don't think there was many prosecutions on that, but yeah.
But
there was the threat of it.
And the fact that that happened in the United States is something that most people don't know about our history. It's certainly never taught to me in school at all. But that being a fundamental core part about how the U.S. government, grabbed power and then maintained it.
I mean, if a government just simply came out and said, hey, these pieces of paper, you're all going to use this as money, ready, go, no one would do it. Like, it only worked because people first trusted gold. The dollars were an abstraction of that gold. They were supposed to be an IOU, a claim check for that gold. And then, you kind of had the rug pulled out from them. The gold disappeared. But at that point, what are you going to do? Like, coming out of World War I, the US dollar was the cleanest dirty shirt. Like, before that, the UK had been the global, empire. The pound was the world reserves currency. But the UK, coming out of World War I, they needed to devalue their currency to basically pay for the war. So they had to leave the gold standard. And so the US emerged as still the best opportunity, because this is all opportunity costs. Like, you have to use some form of money. And the gold at this point was all sitting in, government controlled vaults. So there wasn't really the opportunity for citizens to revolt and say, no, we're going to use gold as money anyway. The gold most of it was tied up. And so you look at the available options, and the dollar was the best. And then coming out of World War II, it was completely solidified as that. The US emerged as, we really had the only functional strong military at that point. Then we had the Bretton Woods Agreement, where the dollar was tied to gold and everyone else's currency was tied to the dollar. And although US citizens couldn't redeem their dollars for gold, other countries could. And so other countries would basically use the dollar for the reserves, but anytime they wanted their gold back, they could exchange at $35 an ounce to get their gold. And so people respond to incentives. And so these countries start realizing, hey, this is redeemable for gold, but there's not actually enough. I don't think there's actually enough gold if all of the countries want to redeem their US dollars for gold. So, hey, maybe we should redeem ours while we have it. And then you effectively got a run on the bank from like nation states. And so that was in 1971 when Nixon closed the gold window and said, due to the strength of the US economy, we don't need gold anymore. We're going to temporarily close the gold window and make it not redeemable for anybody. And then it became permanent 3 years later when I think we officially went off the gold standard.
And the story, whether it's lore or not, is that weren't the French sending ships
Yeah, I've
over?
heard this. I haven't been able to verify this, but I've seen it in several sources because I think the other thing that had happened during World War II is a lot of nations, their own gold stores, they actually sent to the US where they'd be more safe, because the US we're very lucky geographically. We're hard to attack. We've got oceans on both sides of us, and we're friendly with our neighbors to the north and the south. And so, whereas Europe has had multiple wars, and, their gold wasn't safe there. So a lot of, I think, the gold, the story I've heard is a lot of France's gold was in the US and they kind of want it back. So they sent over a battleship to pick up their gold. And it was why it was in transit that Nixon closed the gold window. So anyway, then we had this where when we were on Bretton Woods and coming out of World War II, the US had a huge advantage. We had the global reserve currency. Everybody wanted the dollar for their own central bank reserves. And so it made the currency of the US really valuable. Like, it allowed us to be able to buy things from other countries very cheaply. And so imports were really inexpensive for us, but it was hard for us to compete for work. Our exports became more expensive because our currency was more valuable. And so that's part of what led to the hollowing out of our manufacturing base, was the fact that we had the global reserve currency. So it's both a privilege and a curse. Like, having the world's global reserve currency gives you a lot of benefits, but it also has some issues. This is Triffin's dilemma, if you've ever heard that term, where it's like, it's going to create an issue because it creates trade imbalances. And in order to help offset that, the US was incentivized to print more money, to issue more debt, to create more money, to kind of bring down the value of the dollar, to make us a little more competitive, which then exacerbated the situation, because now there's even less gold relative to the number of dollars out there, and made other countries want to come take their gold. And so after we went off the gold standard, the US, that was the 70s. That's when we had inflation. And there was kind of a concern that the dollar may fall. Like, who's going to want the dollar if it's not backed by anything? And so that's how we got the petrodollar system, as it's often called, where Saudi Arabia was the major oil exporter. We were probably their largest customer, but many other people were buying oil too. And we went to Saudi Arabia and said, hey, you guys need security. We have the best Navy. We'll keep all the straits open. We'll keep everything moving. In exchange, you price all oil in dollars, which meant that anyone that needed energy, which is everybody, needed dollars to do so. And so it actually, if anything, probably increased the demand for US dollars even than when we were on a gold reserve standard.
Because the only way Saudi Arabia is going to sell you a barrel of oil is if you
have dollars.
first exchange for dollars.
So you have to get dollars. And so this has been, I mean, it's been really good for us in many ways, but it's also made us a little bit more vulnerable. And the reality is like, we will never pay off the debt. If we pay off the debt, that creates deflation. This goes back, I think, to the original question of how we got here. Like, why are economists so worried about deflation? And so when you have a monetary system that's based purely on credit, that means one person's liability is another's asset. And if whoever's liability is, if they can't pay, so whether that be a company or whatever, they can't pay, that means someone else's asset gets repriced down. They lose value. And when your money is someone else's liability and that liability can't be paid off, your money becomes worthless. And so if you end up with deflation, you get a deflationary spiral and the whole system basically resets. And that could have been something that we could have tolerated early on, but it's the whole forest fire analogy. We refuse to let the small fires burn. We've always kicked the can down the road to avoid, too big of a crash, too many companies going bankrupt. And we've created it such that now if you were to have that, the fire would be so big, it would likely take the whole system down.
And a good example of that would be 2008.
Oh yeah.
The banks are too big to fail. The only way we're going to be able to keep these banks so that they don't fail is to print a bunch of money and hand it out to those banks, which means you've just created more liabilities, or how does that?
Yeah. I mean, well, because so in order to get more dollars, you need more treasuries, and treasuries are debt. I think there's not very many people left that really believe the US is ever going to pay off the debt. And if you look at the incentives behind it and what that would do, like it's just not going to happen. It'd be so painful that no politician is going to do that. In fact, most voters wouldn't vote for it. It would be way too painful in the short term. And so unfortunately, like you can't fix the system from within the system. Like we can't just stop printing money and allow the system to go into deflation, because it would be so painful that everyone would be crying for, to stop it. So instead we will devalue the currency. We'll likely continue to print money. Although right now in 2022, we're kind of doing the opposite. We're in a, tightening policy. And I think if you look at the longer arc, we're going to be back to printing money at some point. It's really that's going to be the release valve.
Yeah, I'd like to actually talk about this. So how would you explain to somebody, like you kind of feel like you understand what's going on with the Fed when they're like, hey, we're raising interest rates on borrowing money, and this is going to make it more expensive. So people want to go out, and if you're going to do a giant building project, you want to get that money now. But what are the other things that are going on?
I don't know that they actually want people to go take out a bunch of loans. Really, what they're trying to do is, in order to bring inflation down, they need to reduce demand. So there's two ways that they could, inflation is just prices going up. The way we define inflation these days isn't the money supply. That used to be how we would define inflation. Like how much is the money supply expanding? That was the inflation rate. Today, when we say inflation, we mean the consumer price index, the price of goods, and it's this basket of goods that, changes a little bit over time. And so in order to reduce the prices going up, they need to either reduce demand or increase supply. Well, the supply chains have been kind of all messed up out of COVID. And so instead we're reducing demand. And how do you reduce demand? They won't directly say this. You reduce demand by creating unemployment, like so that people don't have the money to spend and people will consume less, which reduces demand and allows prices to come down. And so it's kind of one of those things that it will be good for, it may bring inflation down, but it's going to hurt a lot of people in the process.
Your point about the CPI being the way we kind of measure what the money supply is, we could talk about just how ridiculous the basket of goods is. Because the way they do it is they say, okay, the consumer price index is, let's imagine everybody has to buy these essential goods, and we're going to put those in a basket, and we're going to keep measuring how much does that basket of goods cost. Although they throw out things like healthcare, housing, even
housing
energy
is probably the biggest.
Yeah. And but let's put like that aside for a second. One of the fascinating things you pointed out to me, I didn't even realize, was we don't actually know how much money is in circulation, right? There's no like Excel spreadsheet.
I mean, there's measurements, but none of them are accurate. I mean, usually M2, which includes, all the notes out there, includes bank deposits, like cash, a lot of cash equivalents. But I mean, it was in 1982 that the Fed actually stopped trying to manage the money supply and started just focusing on, adjusting interest rates and open market. Like, we don't know. And then on top of that, you've got the whole Eurodollar system. So, and Eurodollar isn't just in Europe. It basically means anywhere outside the US, most international contracts are priced in dollars. And that's because the dollar is the world's kind of unit of account, the world's reserve currency. And so when you have all these contracts priced in dollars, in order to fulfill that contract, you need dollars. And so that's effectively trading as money. Like, it creates demand for dollars, even though it's not in a dollar system. And so anytime that you create a new loan based on dollars that's not tied into the US financial system, you're effectively creating money, but the Fed actually doesn't have much control over that. And so, yeah, if you add that into the system, we don't know how much money is out there. And that's what's unique about Bitcoin. Anyone can audit and know how much at the base layer, how much money do we have. Now, I do think that if we end up on a Bitcoin standard, there will still be fractional reserve banking, there will still be credit, and there'll be a whole layer 2 of kind of what we have now. The difference is when a company or a nation or whatever can't fulfill their liabilities, rather than printing more to paper over it, there's going to have to be a real clearing of the system.
Yeah, let's talk about fractional reserve banking, because this is one of those things that, like, once you start to look at it, you're like, wait a second, I really didn't understand. I think one of the best examples of fractional reserve banking, if you have no knowledge of the system, is to look at It's a Wonderful Life, right? So the story is, George is, about ready to leave town, and people come into the bank and they're like, I want my money back, because I'm afraid that it's not going to be worth anything, or that bank may go bankrupt. So George stands up and is like, no, your money's not here. It's in your house and in that hardware store. Because the way the banking system works is people put deposits in, or this is the way people think the banking system works. It doesn't actually work this way anymore. But the essentially is people think, okay, I've got 100 people that have come in, they've brought their salary in, they've put a certain amount in the savings account, and they're going to get a percentage of interest. The bank is going to pay you for those deposits. And in exchange, they're going to take that money and they're going to loan it out to all these other businesses, who those businesses are going to pay interest on those loans. And then that's how the bank covers the interest that they have to pay to the people, and the bank itself makes money.
And as long as everyone pays off their debt, the system works and the system grew, and it's probably good. The problem is that doesn't always happen. So, I mean, the way that I think of fractional reserve banking is kind of think of how it evolved over time. So if you look back to, say, 15th century England, goldsmiths were like the original banker there. So goldsmiths were already experts at, safely storing precious metals. And so customers would bring their gold and say, hey, will you store this for me safely? And he would give them a deposit, piece of paper that was, again, the coat check example, the IOU, you come exchange this for your coin. And people would pay him to store their coins, that he was providing a service. And that was full reserve banking. So anytime, even if every one of his customers shows up with their deposit on the same day and wants to exchange it for gold, he has all the gold there. So then over time, though, those deposit slips begin circulating as cash, because people know that the goldsmith is good for him. He has a good reputation. And so it's a lot easier to just not go ever transact in gold. It's much safer to use the piece of paper. And so people start doing that and they become cash. So no one's asking for their deposits back. And then someone comes to the banker, the goldsmith, says, hey, I'm a successful entrepreneur. I'd like to expand my business. Can I borrow some of that gold you have in your vault to do that? And he says, I don't really feel good about that. People are paying me to store it. That would be dishonest. And he says, well, I'll tell you what, I'll pay you interest. And then you can share that interest with your depositors. And so then rather than them paying you, you'll actually pay them, and everyone's better off. And I'm good for it. Like, I'll pay it back. And so, he does that. And then instead of the customers paying, they now get paid for their deposits. They get interest, and everyone's happy. And as long as the entrepreneur pays off his debt, then everyone grew, and we got a new business. And so everyone's better off. And that's fractional reserve banking, because, that he then lent, let's say the banker has 100 gold coins and there's 100 customers, each with one gold coin. Now the entrepreneur comes along and borrows 90 of them. Well, no one's redeeming their gold coins for cash. You're redeeming their cash for gold coins, so that's fine. But if more than 10 people show up and want their gold coins back, we have a problem. It's inherently unstable. And so that's how people think of fractional reserve banking, and people have mixed opinions on that. Some people still think it's not right. Some people think this is great. Like, the economy is expanding, everyone's better off. Now we don't have to pay to store gold. Like, this is good. It seems like a fair exchange.
But the reason people might not like it is because you are creating money.
I think
right?
the reason people don't like it is a lot of people assume even today that like when they go put money in a bank that it's being held safely in a vault, they don't realize that it's not actually there. It's being lent out. And so it's more of a people's presumptions aren't right about it. But if they think about it, it's like, well, why would someone pay you to keep your money safe? Like there's a reason they're paying you. And so, but the way fractional reserve banking works in the modern world, they just kind of flip that on its head. So they say, okay, well, if you go to a bank and want to borrow money, they don't go take that money out of the vault and give it to you. They don't even need to have the money in their possession. They can just create money. So, they'll add to the asset side of their balance sheet a, loan receivable from you, and then they'll credit your checking account with the amount of money that you borrowed, and they can just create money.
Maybe let me put that another way. If you go to a bank and you take out a loan for $1,000, you're not going to go spend that $1,000 right away. You may take part of that loan, and then you're going to actually, let's just say you take $100 of that loan to put into your business, and now you've got $900 left over. You're going to put that in your checking account or in your own savings account.
So it offsets.
And so then the bank's like, hey, look, we just got $900 more back in our system. We can loan that out again.
So think about the example where before, the banker had 100 gold coins. He has 100 deposits. Everything balances from an accounting perspective. He then lends 90 of those gold coins out to the entrepreneur, adds a note receivable for 90 gold coins. So guess what? He still has 100 gold coins or claims on gold coins on the asset side, and he has 100 deposits. Everything balances. In the modern way, the banker would only need, $10 in his vault and, 10 depositors, and someone comes along and wants to borrow $90. Well, he doesn't have $90 in the vault. Well, that's fine. We'll just create a loan for $90. We'll put the loan on our asset side, and then we'll create a checking account for $90. And you get to the exact same spot. You still have $100 or gold coins, whatever denomination you want to use, on the asset side and 100 on the liability side. Like this is all just accounting tricks. Like, double entry bookkeeping is what allows us to create money, not by mining and minting coins, but just through accounting journal entries. And so the problem is it's an inherently unstable system. Because if someone does default and the bank isn't properly reserved, the bank becomes insolvent and all those depositors lose their wealth, which is why we have, the FDIC to prevent those bank runs, and why, banks are often bailed out. We typically just print more so that people don't actually experience loss, but then that creates moral hazard, and you get banks and companies lending out money that they wouldn't if they didn't think they had the chance of getting bailed out.
So somebody could be listening to this and be like, yeah, I mean, you guys have all this criticism, but look, it's working, right? Like
it is.
Cars and
Totally.
the economy.
And so in any layered financial system where you have a credit-based monetary system, you have to have sufficient trust. And that obviously has been there, or in other words, the benefits of being able to transact with paper or the digital representations of paper far outweighed physical transfer of precious metals, that people were willing to take on that risk. If people didn't have sufficient trust, we would still be exchanging gold and silver coins for every transaction, which we haven't done for hundreds of years. And so that trust is there. And I think it's undeniable that without modern banking, without fractional reserve banking, without central banks, we would not have grown into this global society that we have today. So I don't want to criticize too much that system, because I think it's what got us here. Those were technological innovations at the time, because gold and silver moved too slow to keep up with global commerce. And so the paper was a good way to do that. And initially it was full reserve, and then it went to fractional reserve, and then it went to, no reserve. I mean, there's really no money in our financial system anymore. When earlier I defined money as being an asset that's no one else's liability. Like there is no money at the base of our system anymore. It's all credit.
And people don't realize banks only need deposits in as much as they are regulated by the government to hold a certain amount. But in effect, when they go to loan that money out, they just go down to the Federal Reserve and they say, hey, we'd like to borrow money at this interest rate because we've got another guy over there that's going to pay us that interest rate plus something.
And this system can work, but if that system were really to be allowed to clear in the free market, then what would happen is if a bank, you'd have some banks that are really conservative and would, not make many loans, or would only make loans that had a very, very high probability of being paid back. And they probably would be able to only offer a lower interest rate to their depositors, because they're not going to be able to charge as much interest to the secured creditors. And then you'd have some banks that are much more risky and would make loans. And in those cases, if those loans don't get paid off, then the depositors lose money. And so, putting your money in a bank would be much more similar to putting your money in a mutual fund. Like, you're trusting the bank managers to make good investments. And if they don't, you're going to lose your wealth. Instead, we have a system where everybody believes that their money is safe, and the FDIC has ensured that to be the case. And so now you've incentivized banks to actually take on more risk, because if the bets pay off, they win. And if they don't, well, the bank goes insolvent, but the depositors don't get left holding the bag, so they don't feel as guilty.
Well, and there's even some nuance there, because a bank, when they're regulated often by the state that they're in and then the federal system that they're in. And the federal, both systems, state and federal, when the regulators come in, they say, are you making enough money? Right? Like, they actually look at not just, are you solvent? They're saying, like, hey, we gave you this charter. Are you being successful with it? Which then forces banks to say, okay, just a few years ago, they didn't actually want too many deposits, because if you have so many deposits, now you owe interest, which wasn't very much, but now that money is not
you aren't
making
able to
money
lend
for
that
you.
out. Yeah.
So
right.
so these bankers are now stuck in this situation where they're not really allowed to go out and make investments into new companies or into they can only do it if somebody's coming to get a loan. So now they have to look at these like weirdly exotic bonds, and they have to like find things that the federal government will allow them to do and put their money in riskier things that have nothing at all to do with the way the bank is working. And if something goes wrong with that bond market, then the deposits they were holding just evaporate.
Right. But the depositors will get bailed out this day and age. So that's my issue, is that the incentives have been so manipulated that it's no wonder we have the system we do. Like, if there's no risk, if you don't ever let the system clear out, then you continue to just perpetuate this moral hazard. And to me, it's not going to be sustainable. But, people have been worried about this since the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, since we went off the gold standard in the 70s. And we're decades later. Like, this system can persist for a very long time. So although I tend to believe it's not sustainable, I am an advocate for things like Bitcoin, I don't know when that transition happens. Like, it's not really in the US's best interest to move to that, other than as a defensive play, because if other countries do it, that could be, bad for the US.
So one of the books that made me a little bit more Chicken Little than I naturally am was called The Mandibles. Did you read The Mandibles?
I've read it.
And like it's a fascinating book. It's like this dystopian future about like what happens if the US loses its reserve currency status. And one of the ways that the author Lionel Shriver suggests this is, she says, when the Saudis started trading oil in different currencies, right? And like just a few weeks ago, you hear Biden, getting in a fight with Saudi Arabia saying, well, we just may not, offer you military support anymore because that's what keeps you strong. And the Saudis were like, well, you're not going to threaten us. And you start seeing things. Now, I don't know if that's like me being predisposed to like doom porn, or if it's me like saying like, oh, there's something real going on here.
I mean, we do seem to be moving to a more and more multipolar world. I don't know how it plays out. The dollar is still the best fiat currency, like by far. It's still the cleanest dirty shirt. And you see right now with the U.S. raising interest rates, that's wreaking a lot more havoc on other nations' currencies than it is our own. Like,
why? Why does it do that?
I mean, there's interest rate parity. So if we raise interest rates, that would attract capital to the U.S. People would say, why would I invest my money in Japan where I'm earning, 0.25% on a 10-year bond, whereas if I invest in the US, I can get 4%. And so money flows to the US. And so other countries either have to raise interest rates themselves to be competitive, or their exchange rate of their currency, the US, will change. And most so far have chosen to allow their currency to devalue against the dollar, which allows then you to get back to parity. But yeah, I don't know how there are some theories that this may ultimately play into the US. So one of the things that happened to America back in 1907, so part of how we got the Federal Reserve was because the Federal Reserve was actually our third central bank. We had two central banks prior. The charters were never renewed. So early Americans were very distrusting of central banks. They'd seen what happened in England. They didn't want a central bank to finance the government's debt, basically. But then in 1906, we had the San Francisco earthquake, which decimated the city. Most of those buildings were insured by insurers in London. And so enormous amounts of capital were having to flow from the UK to America, which was bad for the UK economy. And so the UK very, very quickly raised interest rates, like I think 2.5% over a very short period of time, which attracted a lot of that capital back to the UK and out of the US, and it threw the US into a panic, the panic of 1907, which is where most of those pictures of like people lining up outside the banks, that was from, and the UK did that to us by raising interest rates, and it worked for them. It allowed them to kind of hang on to their power a little bit longer. They ultimately lost it after World War One. And so by us raising interest rates, we're doing the same thing to other countries. We're pulling capital out of those countries when they need it most and in strengthening the US. And I mean, there's some people that believe that that's part of the playbook. Raising interest rates isn't just to bring down inflation. It's also to increase demand for the dollar by bringing other people in. And potentially as some of those currencies fall, people will dollarize. They'll adopt the dollar as their currency. And so I think the dollar is likely to be around for a very, very long time, and things will likely be denominated in the dollar for a long time. And yet I also believe Bitcoin will continue to gain value. And I think it would be very wise for the US to start accumulating Bitcoin and ultimately backing the dollar by Bitcoin. I don't know that they'll do it, but I think we are in a position where we have the most to lose if we don't do that. And we potentially have a huge opportunity to maintain our position in the world if we do adopt Bitcoin, which I think would be best for the world. Like, as many problems as the US has, like, I still think we are the best. We are more likely to fight for civil liberties and freedom around the world, and that not having the US being a major player, if not the major player in the geopolitical sphere, would be bad. I don't want to live under central bank digital currencies and social credit scores and all the stuff coming out of China. Despite all the problems we have here in the US, I'd much rather have this. So if the US can maintain its position, I think that's a good thing. I don't want to see the US dollar, go down too far.
Yeah, I find that being like something difficult for my own personality, right? Like I'm like hey, we've got this idea, we know how things work, and so I'm on like Bitcoin works, but I don't want to be rooting against the US economy.
No, I don't
right?
think that.
I like, but I
for
feel
multiple reasons. One, because it's our home country, but two, I believe that our principles and ideals are still, despite there's all sorts of examples where we've strayed from these, but I still put more confidence in that than I put in other systems.
What would it look like for a country to back their currency, whether it's the US or somebody else, with Bitcoin? What does that mean?
I mean, it could look more similar to what we used to have with the gold standard where it's redeemable. I don't know. I mean, this is a big question. I don't really see the US being eager to do so. And I would hope that in that world that there would still be the option for people to self-custody, where they basically, not only do they have to not do fractional reserve banking, but that they can actually just hold their own keys, and they hold that money as though they were holding gold coins. And so to me, that's potentially where the world would go. If we ended up on a Bitcoin standard, there would still be fractional reserve banking, but you would opt into it. And the difference is, if that bank failed because they made bad investments, the depositors would be wiped out, or at least bailed in to some degree. And people would have to understand those risks. It would bring along a lot of self-responsibility. And if you don't want that, then you should put your money at a full reserve bank or self-custody it.
Yeah, that old line among Bitcoiners, which like, not your keys, not your coin. But that didn't, I told that at the beginning, I had so many revelations about Bitcoin as I've gone on. And the biggest one, the one that was like the most awe-inspiring, was when I spun up a node.
Yeah, I've heard you say this.
So people have talked about Bitcoin, like they know about miners, that somehow, you let these miners go out and they mine and you get Bitcoin for it. We don't need to go into the particulars of it. That's an interesting thing, right? Yeah. That's the security of the system. But when I set up a node, and at the time I was on a bank board, it made me realize, like, wait a second. One of the reasons that you need a bank, or you need multiple banks right now, is the ability to move your money from one place to another, because somebody has to say, yeah, that whether it's Visa or it's a bank with ACH or something, they say, if I want to move money from me to you, I got to go to somebody that says, yes, Vance has those dollars in his account. Now we're going to move them up to the cloud and now down to David. But once you get a node, and that node first, when you plug it in, you now are downloading the entire blockchain. So you are finding out every single transaction that has ever occurred, and it goes on to your little SSD card. And now you can get on to what I think of really is the information superhighway. And now I don't need a third party to be able to say, will you move this money from my account over to David's account? I can instead say, hey, send me your address. And I didn't realize, I had held Bitcoin in things like Coinbase before. And I always thought, well, I've got the keys, I can send that money. But in effect, if Coinbase decided like,
You still need permission.
David's not a good guy, we don't really like him, you can't do that. With the node, once you have a node, nobody can stop you.
Right. And so some people love that and some people that terrifies. Like I tend to be in that camp where I think people should be heir to free, but it also means your enemies can use Bitcoin. It also means your enemies don't need permission. And that irks a lot of people. And to me, it's not that I think that that there's not evil or bad people in the world. It's just that it gets messy very quickly. When we cheer on when, protesters in other countries protest against stuff and their bank gets frozen and they use Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies to get around it because they're protesting against police violence. We think that's great. They're being activists. The same thing happens in the Western world and it's domestic terrorism.
Yeah. I mean, just look at the difference between January 6th and, Antifa or Floyd riots. Like most people would say, oh, this one or that one, those are good. I want them to be able to send money. But the other side, I don't want them to be able to do that. And you're giving up control over that.
I don't want to get into whether one's right. But if all you have to do is flip around and say, assume your least favorite political, politician is in power and you want to speak out against what they're doing, well, you could very easily find yourself on the other side of that. There's now been precedent laid. And I think the most obvious was earlier this year in Canada, the trucker convoy that they were protesting COVID mandates. And they, along with any of their financial supporters, had their bank accounts frozen. And I think that's something that many Canadians, certainly, and many Americans, thought that was justified. Like these people shouldn't be shutting down the Capitol over something that, but I think all you have to do is flip that around. And yeah, like what if for, any other march that we see as good for the world and there's different politician power and they think you can't protest, we're going to freeze your bank accounts. Like you now take away people's economic ability and you do make them more likely to listen to you. It's more authoritarian. So I tend to be more, I want to avoid authoritarian wherever it is, and I realize that will bring more. There'll still be bad actors, but I think again the good more than outweighs the bad.
That's one of the things about Bitcoin adoption that's been very interesting. So huge amount of our listeners are from Canada, and like the people in the trucker convoy, I think there were a lot of people up in Canada that before were like, hey, we're all trying to get along. Canadians like to get along. They don't really want to, certainly the audience in Saskatchewan or Alberta, they don't really like the people in the city. There's that tension. But overall, they were saying, but things are okay. And then when they watched that they had sent $100 or $1,000, and it was just not just didn't go to where they wanted, confiscated and potentially going to be given to somebody else. Like all of a sudden, this woke people up to like, whoa. In the past, the government never did this to us, and so are we ratcheting up? And I think it opened up a whole different group of people's eyes to a technological advancement that before would have been like, that's not.
It was one of the things that made me more bullish on Bitcoin, or made me realize that it was even more important than I previously thought. Initially that was all theoretical to me. Like I had heard the stories in other countries of bank accounts being frozen and all that stuff. I was like, well, I mean, part of the reason I think a lot of Americans have trouble understanding Bitcoin is that we have a relatively well-functioning society and monetary system compared to other places in the world. So we don't see the immediate need. But when I saw that in Canada, I was like, oh my goodness, like that could easily happen here, regardless of which side you're on. And then a few months later, not even a few months later, you have, freezing Russia's foreign reserves. And it's like, despite whether you agree with that, like you've now set the precedent that any country that's not very, very closely aligned with our agenda needs to be careful about holding their assets in the, US financial system or something tied to that. And so, I mean, some of the best advertisements for Bitcoin have been the governments and central banks that stand the most to lose from it, which is just ironic.
So speaking of governments and central banks, there's an interesting thing that happens in a government that, like in the United States, people didn't want more taxes, right? So they said, if a politician stood up and were like, I'm going to raise taxes by 30% to cover the infrastructure changes we need or to cover these programs, people would be like, no way. Well, the government figured out very quickly, well, we can do a tax that most people don't realize. We'll just print money. And we talked about printing money before, but we didn't talk about like what are the mechanics of how a government prints money, and what is this concept quantitative easing?
Yeah, I mean, quantitative easing isn't necessarily printing money. There's somewhat of a debate in the economic community about that, but quantitative easing is simply the Federal Reserve buying bonds, typically from banks or other large financial institutions, and exchanging for cash that they've just created. And so it like reduces the average maturity on U.S. obligations, but more than anything, it injects liquidity back into the financial system. Now, most of that money stays within the financial system, doesn't get out to everyday people spending, and so you don't usually see that hit price inflation. So in that regard, people say it's not really printing money because when you print money, it goes straight to the people and it increases demand for goods temporarily until we get a new price where everything clears. But I think what you have happening is it ends up bidding up other scarce resources. So you see things like stocks, like real estate. People want to hold that rather than dollars because those are more scarce and they hold value. So you've seen those things go up way more than the CPI. So although the basket of goods we may buy, as consumers when we go to the grocery store and shopping has only gone up on average a few percent a year until this year, real estate's gone up way higher than that. And effectively what we've done is we've forced some of the monetary premium to leave the dollar and flow into these other assets. And which means that the people getting left behind are the people that didn't already own those assets, and they're getting ever and ever further out of reach. Houses today are way, way more expensive than they were before. And a lot of that ties much more closely to the printing of money, the expanding of the money supply than it does CPI increases. Because remember, I said all technology is deflationary. Like most things should be getting cheaper over time. The reason they don't is because we print money to offset that. Well, certain things technology doesn't create more of. It doesn't create more land. Like, yes, you can create taller buildings, but that also is a lot more expensive to create that building. And so these things that are more scarce, so you've got real estate, you've got healthcare that requires a lot of human inputs, education, like those things haven't gone down. Those things have gone way up in price. And a lot of those aren't captured in the CPI. So housing used to be, like asset values of housing used to be in the CPI, and they changed the definition, I think it was back in the 80s, to owner's equivalent rent. So they said, what would it cost to rent your own home? And so that's one of the reasons we haven't seen the inflation show up there is that although property values have gone way up, rentals haven't gone up as much. In other words, the rate of return you would expect on real estate now has gone down as the prices have gone up. And so because the rent level is relatively the same, it doesn't show up in CPI. But if you hold the asset, wow, it's gone up significantly. And so, yeah, people often, when we talk about taxes, are worried about, is the tax progressive enough? Like it should be taxed, those who have more should be taxed at a higher rate. Well, when we print money and through inflation, it's an invisible tax essentially, but it's a lot more arbitrary. It's not targeting specific income levels or anything. It's whoever holds the dollars. Well, as a percentage of your wealth, who holds more cash? It's not wealthy people. Wealthy people have, although they hold a lot of cash on an absolute level, they have most of their assets in stocks and real estate and other things. Those things all benefit when the money supply increases. Those who hold most of their savings in cash, maybe they only have a bank account, they see the value of the purchasing power of their dollars go down and down and down. It makes it harder and harder for them to get ahead.
When people, we started this conversation, we were early talking about deflation, right? And they talk about just the crisis that can occur. And they always point to Japan. And they say, look at how terrible it's gone for Japan. They've lost a generation. They're way behind. What's going on there? What is that all about?
I mean, Japan's more indebted than any other country. They're a little bit different of our circumstance. A lot of their debt is owned within the country, whereas a lot of U.S. debt is owned by foreign countries.
Meaning that their own citizens have been like, hey, I want to buy Japanese bonds.
Yeah, I don't know that they're still eager to buy them because Japan has pegged their 10-year rate at 0.25%. And so that's why you see the yen as the currency valuation has gone way down. Relative to the U.S. dollar. The U.S. dollar is way more valuable than the yen. So the Japan, through us raising interest rates, has had to basically buy. They promise to buy any bonds that they need to in order to keep the interest rate at 0.25% on the 10-year bond. So they've effectively bought bonds and exchanged yen. So they're adding more yen to the system and taking bonds offline, which is expanding their money supply. So it's devaluing their currency. So that's how they're dealing with it. And we'll see how it plays out. I mean, these are kind of experiments that we don't know. Like this is the first time in history we've been on a pure fiat system with nothing backing it for this much time. Every other time that you've tried to take the precious metals away, the system kind of falls apart. So we'll see. Like, I don't know how it's going to end. And a lot of people do look ahead to Japan to see, well, what can the US do? It's an experiment. I think that's the thing that people realize. People assume that this is the way it's supposed to work. This is the way it's always worked. We've only lived in this regime for 50 years.
That's mind-boggling, right? Like, that's one of those things. I have a regular conversation with people I'm close with about Bitcoin and their big thing as well. It's really only been around like 15 years at this point, right?
I think it turned, well, the white paper was 14 years ago, 2 days ago.
Yeah. So like, it's only been around, and how can we trust it? And I think they're completely right about like, we really don't know how the government will regulate it. It's entirely possible that we'll get 4 or 5 years down the line and the government will say, turn over your Bitcoin or it's illegal, or you're just not allowed to denominate.
There's a lot to be excited about Bitcoin, but yeah, there's still risk to it.
But like, I think when I look around at the world and I start saying like, what's going to happen, how I start asking myself, well, am I reading good enough news? Am I absorbing information from places that will give me a robust view to be able to see as far to the horizon as I can? What about you? Where do you get your information from?
Random places. I mean, I over time have, I try to pay attention and keep my ears open to people that are saying things that seem to make sense and what models they're using to, come to those predictions, and then how accurate do those predictions turn out. Models make predictions, and then from there you can evaluate and, did they get lucky? Did they actually have some insight? And you start to try to update your own mental models to be more informative. But I don't think there is one good source. I mean, increasingly, like, the general news that's not being where the ideas are coming from. And that's where I think, Twitter is amazing. Some of the best thought leaders are on there. There's also a ton of noise, but over time you can find the people that seem to be good at finding the signal and use that somewhat as filters to determine what gets to you. But I think you do need to be very careful not ending up in an echo chamber. Not only aligning yourself with one group, not only aligning, not ever breaking outside of your own followers to see like what other people are saying. And so I try to stay very open-minded, but there's not one source that I see as gospel. And if this person said it or this organization, like, that's got to be it.
You came back to Twitter after a 5-year hiatus?
Yeah. Well, I mean, posting on Twitter.
You've been a lurker for the last 5 years. What brought you back? Why'd you decide to?
Well, I mean, I guess what made me leave was I just felt like I didn't have much to add to the conversation. It was also during that time period I had 3 kids and was busy with other stuff. And then what brought me back was more I've started speaking and sharing views more publicly on things like Bitcoin, and people are going to go there to look for it. And so I've started dabbling with it a little bit because that's where the conversations are happening. That's where all the thinkers are. And so that's where I was anyway. And as people started wanting to communicate with me, I felt like I needed to get back on Twitter. So yeah.
Yeah, it's been a rather seismic shift since I've known you. Like, you've always been very willing to share what you think and both sides of the coin, but you are not a public face. And just recently you've started, well, at least that I knew of.
Yeah, no, I tend to prefer to be more under the radar. In part because I like to explore ideas, and as soon as you go out publicly with them, now you've got people attacking you and it makes it harder to change your position. I don't ever want to feel like I have to defend a position when the information has changed. I don't want to have to always be consistent with what I thought prior. And so there's always the risk to that when you put that out publicly. Like, you've got to then explain any shift you made, and, it can be tiring. Sometimes, I'm much more interested in just learning and continuing to that. And, it came out in conversations like this. I got asked to be on some panel about cryptocurrencies earlier this year, and I initially turned it down. I was like, I don't really want to be a public figure in the crypto space at all. Like, although I'm, into Bitcoin, like, it's not really an area that didn't think I wanted to be known for. But they came back to me and said, no, we really want you. And, on that panel, I kind of laid out why I thought most of crypto people should be very skeptical of, but I thought that there may actually be some signal there with Bitcoin. And then lots of other people wanted to talk to me about that in here. So I kind of stumbled upon it, and yeah, now I'm out publicly that I support Bitcoin and think it's a good thing. And so now,
how does it feel to be in that public position? I mean, it's not brand new, so you're not like early adopter territory.
I didn't think I was early until, I looked around for other financial advisors that were Bitcoin only, and I found like half a dozen of them. Like, there's not many. So no, I think we're actually extremely early. Despite me thinking I was really late to the game, it took me 3 tries to understand it. I saw some analysis by somebody saying, what is real Bitcoin adoption? Well, first, how do you define adoption? A lot of those studies show anyone that's ever basically touched Bitcoin, they've opened an account on Coinbase, they've bought, $10 worth. And someone, if you instead you define as someone that owns, say, 0.1 Bitcoin, so about 2,000 US dollars worth of Bitcoin, how many addresses have at least that, and using that as a proxy for adoption. And this probably overstates it because many people have multiple addresses. It's less than 1% of the population has adopted Bitcoin. Like, we are still extremely early, which is why when you look out and see the world, like, I'm not saying Bitcoin is a foregone conclusion, although I do have a lot of conviction in it. I wouldn't put my entire wealth in Bitcoin despite believing in it. That it's so asymmetrical, the opportunities here, that if Bitcoin really grows into any of these things that we think it could be, it'll be way more valuable than it is today. So there's another Bitcoiner who's an ex-bond trader, Greg Foss, who thinks his price target is like $2 million. And he's very, very confident that it'll get there.
What does that mean, a price target?
He thinks that Bitcoin will eventually be worth $2 million per Bitcoin. And he gets there, I think, by saying, once institutions understand Bitcoin, they're likely to allocate 5% of their portfolio to it. It's a similar allocation to how some institutions allocate to things like gold or other natural resources. And doing that would increase Bitcoin's price, he thinks, to about $2 million. And he says, I'm not 100% sure, but I do have a lot of conviction in it. But if you look at what the market's pricing on whether they think it's right, well, Bitcoin's trading at $20,000. So that's, a difference of 100x. Like, that means Bitcoin says, or the market says, there's a 1% chance that he's right, that Bitcoin's going to be worth $2 million today. I don't know what the chances are, but I think it's higher than 1%. And so the asymmetry in the opportunity here is significant, but I think people still need to be very careful that the time scale on which that happens is very unknown. And he'll say it himself, like, I don't know the time. Like, could be 5 years, it could be 50 years. And so I do, none of this should be taken as investment advice. Do your own research if it's not obvious. But I think we're still early enough that you need to be careful. You shouldn't put more money than you can afford to wait for a very long time, and be okay with the possibility that it goes to zero. I think that's very unlikely, but I think you need to be okay with that possibility. And, for my clients, we're in a position where they can be successful, whether the current system continues on as is without any major paradigm shift, or if we move to a more Bitcoin-centric world. And so I'm hoping that they will be successful. My job is to make sure they're going to be successful no matter what happens. The future is uncertain.
How did it go when you write this letter to your, people that have acquired wealth? They have their ideas about how money is gone. Like, I was giggling with
yeah, you were excited. You had been waiting a long time for that email. A lot of interest. So shortly Bitcoin a year ago was trading at like $67,000, something like that. And now it's trading at about 20,000. And so a lot of people, I've had numerous people say, well, I want to wait till it's going back up. Let me know when it's just going to go up. And then I want to say, I don't know. So at this point, I'm trying to get clients to have like 1%. And that's not much, but it's a small enough amount that I think they could easily absorb that if it went to zero. The way markets have been moving lately, portfolio values change more than 1% in a given day. And that the price is low enough right now that if you were to allocate to 1% and just let that grow, not rebalance, that very well may be enough to provide kind of that insurance against what if the dollar and all these other assets get demonetized over time and Bitcoin kind of steals that monetary premium. Like, I view it much more as a hedge. Now, I think a lot of my clients don't really understand Bitcoin. Like, I've tried to explain it, but it's hard to explain Bitcoin. I've given presentations on Bitcoin, and the shortest I've been able to get that presentation down to is an hour and a half. And that's just to provide like a foundational level of, you need to have the context to understand these concepts before we dive into it as an investment strategy or as anything else. And that's really hard. Most people don't want to sit through an hour and a half presentation of something that they're not already interested in. And so I've kind of said, I'm okay with clients borrowing my conviction enthusiasm up to about 1%. And that's kind of what I'm recommending for most of them. It depends a little bit. And I'm okay if they go higher than that, but they need to kind of do their own research and have their own conviction, make sure they really understand it. Because it is very different than any other financial asset, anything else that, normally would be in the portfolio. And we don't even directly manage it. I am a big believer in the ethos of Bitcoin of being not your keys, not your coins. And so I'm also trying to educate my clients on how to eventually take self-custody or collaborative custody of it, or some of these things.
I agree with that 100%. So I enjoy the act of engaging with people on Bitcoin, in particular, if they have actual criticisms of it. If it's people that are just like, oh, well, that might not work, right? But like, that's more interesting. And I think I can explain Bitcoin in about 40 minutes, but I have to be able to draw. I have to be able to like sit in front of them and draw it out. But one of the things that's happened multiple times is people are like, all right, well, will you help me buy some Bitcoin? And I'm like, no, because the act of setting up a node, opening an account, doing these various things are the critical steps that you need to move from being like, I don't know, this is kind of a wacky, neat idea, to being like actually valuable to you. Because otherwise, if somebody else does it for you, it really isn't different than getting a bond.
Well, and you're going full self-custody, which is the ideal way to do it. But I think the reality is most people aren't going to do that. I think the next round of adopters is going to be people that are going to want more support. There's a reason they haven't jumped at it. I mean, I talk to a lot of people that say, oh, well, once there's an ETF. I mean, I talk to a lot of advisors that are curious that say, I'm not dealing with all that mess you're doing. It sounds like a headache of trying to teach people how to do this. Like, I'm going to wait till there's an ETF and then I'll buy it in their, in their brokerage account. I think a lot of people want easy, and I think there's products coming for that, but there's trade-offs. I mean, that's a basic economic principle. Like, there's trade-offs to everything.
Yeah. And if it's more convenient, it is less safe. Right. And if it's more safe, it's going to be less convenient.
And people don't understand. I mean, people don't understand the current financial system, and they trust that. So there's a certain also, like I said, by some measures, less than 1% of the population has adopted Bitcoin. And so it's no wonder that people don't feel comfortable with it if they don't really understand on a deep level. But as adoption increases, people will borrow other people's comfort with it, and there's more institutions. And so, some Bitcoiners worry about recreating the existing financial system just on Bitcoin. And I think to some degree that's going to happen, but I don't know that that's bad. Some people, that's what they want. Not everybody wants to understand cryptography and hold their own keys. And
I think my model comes from, I lived in Kenya when they had just adopted this thing called the M-Pesa system, which was essentially using cell phones, which people started to get a lot of, and being able to take what was this. Remember when you used to get those little credit cards and you dial in a number and you'd be able to get new minutes on your cell phone?
Yeah.
Right. So they actually turned that into a financial system that allowed people to do banking. And the M-Pesa system, so both the cell system and the banks work together. And what I realized was, at first, when you get to this new country, you're like totally overwhelmed. And then you're trying to use this banking system. And at first you're like, I can't do this. But then you have something you need to do. And once you need to do it, I need to send money from me to them, or I need to get something. Now, all of a sudden, your ability to learn goes way up because you've got focus on that. And I think that's what I think that people are discounting the adoption curve and the learning curve when it comes down to, I need to do something. And I think the Canadian trucker example would be the perfect one. Like, the people that I know that adopted Bitcoin are in Lloydminster, Saskatchewan. They're in deep Alberta, and all of a sudden they're figuring this out. And it is not anywhere near as hard as people are believe that it is once you have a motivated reason to learn it.
But I think most of the people that have adopted Bitcoin at this stage tend to be intelligent people who tend to be distrusting of the system. Like, they're naturally skeptical people. And so they were earlier to identify the potential need for it. When I think of many of my friends, they're highly intelligent, but they are extremely still trusting of the system, and the system's working very well for them. They haven't had a need for it. And in terms of adopting it, they'd have to adjust many ways that they think about the world, and maybe even many ways that they think about economics. I mean, when I was going through it, there was all sorts of things from economics. And I was like, this never fully made sense to me, despite studying economics in college. Like, it just didn't feel like, really, this is how it works.
Yeah, you're talking about the current system we're in, the Keynesian,
hey, all we can the do macroeconomics and how, like, and that, like, wow, what a simpler system. More the Austrian school, and like, that's heterodox in most econ circles, but to me, it's common sense, and it's just taking microeconomics and expanding it broader. But yeah.
I mean, that follows me exactly, right? Like, I am definitely distrustful. Like,
yeah, I am too. I'm far more paranoid than most of my clients. So,
and the challenge is, like, how do you use that distrust to motivate you to do things that are difficult and without becoming a crazy person, right? Without becoming a person that believes like at every corner, I better be stocking up on iodine tablets.
Well, and so part of it, I mean, like with the clients, like you stopped short of helping them. Like I'm in a position where I feel like that's partially my job. Like I have to be they're hiring me to look further on the horizon than they can see. And so I have more of an obligation, I don't think a legal obligation at this point. I mean, if you look at, if anything, like the regulatory environment won't be kind to Bitcoin. I view it much more as a moral obligation. If this is something that I believe is a real risk, it's my duty to, try to help my clients get there. It's a little bit harder because I can't do it for them. Like I can't buy Bitcoin directly in their brokerage account. I would have to use some roundabout derivative to do so, which is antithetical to my belief in how Bitcoin should work. And so there's more friction to get them there, and that's harder. And that friction is an impediment to a lot of people. But I do think in the years that come, there'll be far better solutions. I mean, part of why Jack Dorsey left Twitter to focus full time on Block wasn't for to grow their credit card business. It was to focus on Bitcoin. After he spent time traveling around Africa, he was like, "This is what the world needs. This will make the world a better place." And he's very focused on creating solutions that make it much more frictionless for anyone to use, and maybe even not have to spin up their own node and all that stuff. I don't think most people want their own node.
Well, we're gonna see about that.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I guess supposedly when it's on your iPhone and you don't have to think about it, then maybe people will.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're not going to see broad adoption if it's at the level.
No, not everyone's going to buy the components to create a Raspberry Pi. That's not going to happen.
That's fair. I think though that, I guess my bigger point is that people are far more competent at being able to do these things
when they're motivated.
Yeah, and that
I think a lot of
motivation
people aren't motivated yet.
Can come very quickly. And
inflation may be one of those catalysts. If inflation sticks around and people see, I think that could be one of the catalysts that gets people to wake up and say, maybe I do need to explore other options.
And I guess my point about bringing M-Pesa is it's not necessarily because a negative thing happened, right? M-Pesa allowed them to do things they had not done before. And all of a sudden they were like, I can figure out how to use this cell phone to send money. And so I guess the reason I keep bringing that up is because for me, I need a scenario in which Bitcoin succeeds that doesn't require the doomsday.
I hope it's not the doomsday. I mean, I think that's a possibility, but I hope that's not the one we go through. I hope it's a much slower, gradual transition, and that we're able to onboard people more slowly, so that's less painful. I mean, ultimately, some of that debt may have to get cleared out and become worthless, but I think if we can do it a slower transition, it'll be less painful for more people. Like, I don't really want to go into complete chaos, anarchy.
Even if I were to win, it would still be
no,
so
I don't want to
painful,
live through that world. Yeah.
So, David Oransky, I had so much more I wanted to talk with you about Waldorf School and ways to think about spending time with friends, but we're run out of time. If people wanted to learn more about your firm or to invite you to come speak, where would they go?
Our website is laminarwealth.com. There's a contact form on there. That's probably the easiest way to get in touch with me. You can find me on Twitter too. I'm more active right now than I have been, but
oh, it's great. I love it. I hope you keep tweeting a bunch.
You can find me there too. Send me a DM. Those should be open now.
And we should make one shout out that you in your office, your wife is also a CFA, and she is extraordinary. And I adore her advice and the way she thinks about things. So
yeah,
consider this being a full endorsement that I think Laminar Wealth is a place.
She's the one that makes everything happen. I'm kind of the crazy professor. She's the one that makes it all work.
Well, I hope people reach out to you. Laminarwealth.com. I'll throw it in the show notes. Thank you so much for coming on.
Sounds good. Thank you, Vance. Appreciate it.